Rabbi David Wolpe, Rabbi at Temple Sinai, Los Angeles. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you and to gain the perspective of your own personal pastoral experience and your own spiritual wisdom in how to deal with some of the challenges that religious leaders and faithful worldwide are dealing with as a consequence of the coronavirus. So for you, good morning. For me, good evening.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
So what's going on for you during these corona times? Well, how is it affecting you? How is it affecting your rabbinate? How is it affecting your life? How is it affecting your spirituality? Where are you holding with it?
So those for me are all distinct questions. Let me start with the personal and move in circles out more generally. One of the things that I feel both grateful and guilty about is that a lot of this is very nice for me. I live with my 23-year-old daughter. I'm home now all the time. She's home all the time. That's a nice thing. I have enough food. Thank God none of us yet are sick. I say yet because you never know. I have lots of time to read. I have lots of time to reflect. I'm doing a lot of things online and having the chance to have conversations like with you, with people who I never otherwise would speak to. And so even though I'm much busier than I might have expected, there's something about this that is very nice. It gives you the opportunity to pause. It's like a Shabbat in life. And I've been able to go much deeper in a lot of ways than I would otherwise have been able to do, and to do things that I would not in the normal course of my life be able to do. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Various other people have pointed out this Shabbat dimension of the project, even as literally as life coming to a standstill, and
yes,
the new opportunities. So this whole period has some kind of a Shabbat sabbatical kind of halo to it.
There's no question, but of course it's more like it's a little closer to Chol HaMoed, because at least you get to cook, you get to do things that you wouldn't otherwise get to do. You sit at home with some of the liberation of the Chol and some of the beauty of the Shabbat that's sort of combined.
So it's a mixture of the sacred and the profane, yeah.
Exactly, like all things. But on the other hand, I think as with all of us, but especially those of us who people turn to, I'm a sort of repository for anxiety. That is, I'm holding the anxiety of many people. I remember when I first graduated, when I first got smicha, when I first graduated rabbinical school. So they gave us a book by a family systems therapist called Generation to Generation. And it was about how, he was also a rabbi. It's about how rabbis, priests, ministers, so on, should operate in their kihilot, in their congregations, in their churches, in their synagogues. And he said, your first obligation is to be a non-anxious presence. Because there's so much anxiety around weddings, funerals, sicknesses, that if you're not anxious, that influence will ripple out. So I'm very blessed to have a fundamentally optimistic nature. I always think things are going to be fine, which sometimes drives the people around me crazy. But at moments like this, it's a very good thing to have, because I tell you, it's going to be okay. You know, I know everybody's losing money economically and everybody's worried health, but we're going to be okay. And I really believe that. I have like this fundamental bitachon, this fundamental trust or faith that things are going to be all right. So I think that's a lot of people are writing to me to hear me say back, it's going to be okay. And I put out every day a 1-minute video, which is supposed to be an inspiration. These days, of course, it's mostly about Passover. But I think also just to see your rabbi and to hear him make a joke, to hear that he's still smiling, that he still feels okay, I think that's calming for people. And then, of course, there are a couple people whom I know who have gotten sick, and that's very much a trial, including a wonderful Eli Beer of Hatzalah, who's in a hospital in Miami, with whom I'm close, and that, of course, is very frightening. But this is, at this point, no different from the reality of everyday life, that people get sick and people, so all those different dimensions are interplaying with the worry of family, and also then the element of technology. We're going to have a Seder, and we're going to use Zoom with my family all over the country. The paradox of that, of course, is if it weren't for the pandemic, we probably wouldn't be Zooming with them all over the country. So we'll have a bigger Seder in some sense than we would have if we weren't quarantined and forced to have a small Seder. So for those of you who are fans of paradox, the pandemic carries many with it.
So you've raised a very interesting question about this anxiety, because anxiety, fear, these are basic responses. And you seem to have two tools to get by this. One is your 23-year-old daughter. Not everyone has that 23-year-old daughter. The second is your natural optimism. That doesn't really leave a lot for exercise and working on yourself and strengthening, or something that can be told to others. 23-year-old daughters are a particular gift, and so is an optimistic nature. So what do you tell, other than radiating confidence and radiating calm, which is obviously vital, what advice can you give to people who are facing fear and anxiety?
So you mentioned the word exercise. I think to the extent that you can do any kind of physical activity, even if it's only walking around your apartment, that is still better than sitting and feeling this rush of adrenaline in your body that has no outlet. Punch a pillow. I mean, really just movement is good. Second is some perspective. Now, perspective is limited. I know that, people have gone through worse things. People are going through worse things. That doesn't necessarily steal your own right to feel aggrieved. I don't tell people, listen, Anne Frank hid in a small room, therefore you shouldn't be upset. I think that that's not fair to the human experience. People get upset, and they know they're smart people, they're thoughtful people. They know other people are suffering more. That doesn't mean that they're not suffering. Nonetheless, it is helpful to keep in mind that if you're lucky enough to be healthy and you're lucky enough to have food, that this will pass. It will pass. And the question that you're dealing with right now is, how do I get to the other side of it? It's not how do I bear with this forever, but how do I get to the other side of it? And that is helpful to remember. And so to the extent that if you love books, reading, if not, I still say you should read, but you can watch things on television. That's a resource we have. You can talk to friends. And for some people, I think it's incredibly important to stay away from the news. For some people, the news is nothing but a trigger for anxiety. And you know what you need to know about coronavirus. Learning that the numbers went up in Italy today actually won't change your life, but it will cause you more anxiety. So you have to limit the things that you bring into your psyche in order for your psyche to be calm. So those are at least some of the things that I would tell people.
I had actually used the term exercise slightly differently. I used it like spiritual exercises, devotional exercises.
I know.
Yes. And you referred, your advice was very appropriate, but not fundamentally different from what a competent psychologist would give. Right. What's the advice that you would give as a rabbi featuring the particular spiritual angle on things? So
now here I would say, first of all, that prayer, we do a minyan morning and afternoon online, that prayer is very powerful no matter what your theological convictions are or aren't. I always tell people that the tefillot are poetry. And you don't read poetry and say, but that might not be correct intellectually, because poetry works on many, many, many different levels. And so I really think that some kind of regular disciplined prayer is incredibly helpful. I'll give you one example from my own life that I've been doing now for years. So for years when I woke up, the first thing I would do is say Modeh.
Meaning?
And then I realized, which is a prayer of gratitude that you say upon awakening. And then I realized when I woke up, I actually didn't feel that grateful, even though I said the prayer I did. But after I woke up, the first thing I would do is walk outside and get the newspaper. And when I walked outside, I felt grateful. So I started to say the Modani, the prayer for gratitude, when I first opened the door. And I tell people, if you feel confined, so open the door to the outside or sit by a window and express your gratitude that this world is still here and that it's still outside and that you still exist and that you have the possibility of more. And the tefillot are supposed, I see them as exercises in this sense of gratitude, because I don't believe, and this is a separate theological question, but I don't believe you ask and get. I don't think the world works that way, and I think most people don't believe the world works that way. But if your prayer changes you, then your prayer is answered. So I pray. I'll give you there's a beautiful example from Leone Medina, who was an Italian rabbi of, I think, the late 1700s. He said, imagine you're standing on the shore and you see a man pulling a boat to the shore. He said, if you were mistaken about mechanics and motion, you might think he was pulling the shore to the boat. And people make the same mistake about prayer. They think they're pulling God to them. I want this, God, so do this, like you're pulling God to you. But in fact, if you do it right, you're pulling yourself to God. And so that's how I think about it, is every day when I pray, I think to myself, how am I transcending the things about me that are petty or small or don't need to be complaints, and drawing myself closer to things that are larger and eternal and so on. And the second part of that is that it should sensitize me to the reality that there are people out there who are really suffering. And there are things that I can still do, even from my quarantined home in Los Angeles, to help their suffering. So those two things, I think, going in yourself and going out of yourself, both of them are important.
Wait, going in yourself is the
prayer is going in yourself, and doing things for others, which is going out of yourself.
Okay.
So
if I could add a footnote, just as two rabbis talking to each other, what you described as the theory of prayer is very much the teaching of Rav Kook on the meaning of prayer. And if you look, this appears in numerous places in his Shmona Kvatzim, which are 8 diaries that he wrote. But it was collated and brought together in the introduction to his Siddur prayer, Olat Re'iyah, in the most poetic way, going back to the notion of poetry, and his description of prayer as the elevation of the soul, and therefore we don't try to change God, but he says in more poetic and mystical way the basic notion that you just shared, grounding it in a sense, not just that you change morally, but you really anchor yourself existentially and cosmically in a higher way through prayer.
Yes, which I'm lucky enough to have felt sometimes. You know,
may you and may we all always feel it, because this really is true prayer when it's transformative. Otherwise, you do it by rote. May all our prayers, and may all the people who are praying during this Corona time, may their prayer be deep enough to be transformative. This is definitely one theme that keeps coming up throughout these interviews. Let me move on to another question, which is the question of the solitude, the enclosure, the quarantine. People have a hard time being inwards. So you've already said break through your inwardness by reaching out to people, and break through your inwardness by going deeper in yourself. Is there anything else you would want to add to this notion of the difficulty of being blocked off, having to go in, for people whose whole life is outward?
So I think that in part this is a function of personality. There really are, there are people who meditate naturally and people who have a very hard time with it. There are people who like solitude and people who feel solitude is a prison and not what's the word I'm looking for? A sanctuary. So what I would say is that life poses different challenges to people in different ways, and that if you see this as not a pause but a preparation, you realize that you're going to rejoin life. And the real question of this entire time is, how will you be different when this is over? So if you find solitude a challenge to you, you're not going to have to do this forever. But this is your one time to go where that resistance is and find out why it's such a challenge to you. Just as somebody who naturally takes to solitude, becoming a rabbi was very good for my soul, because I'm so often thrust into social situations when, if given the choice, I would say, nah, I'd rather stay home. And so I think that it's good that we are thrown these tests in life, but you have to see them, I think, as opportunities as opposed to just obstacles and pains. So if you have a hard time with the solitude, I don't want to say don't reach out. Of course, this is not supposed to be torture, but if you can explore why that is and discover what it is inside of you and in your past that makes it so hard for you to be alone, and what fear arises of your solitude? What is it that you're afraid of when you're alone that will happen? It can't just be boredom, because boredom, everybody gets bored sometimes. There has to be something deeper than boredom. So what is that? If you can discover that, you can use it in a way to elevate yourself, and you will learn a tremendous amount, I think, about yourself. And that has to be part of the desire, is you have to want to know who you are, as opposed to living just a life of externalities. And when something like this comes, when something like this comes along, even though nothing like this has ever come along in my lifetime, but when this came along, it was not, I believe, a designed test. I don't think God looks down at the world and says, you know what, they could use a few weeks alone. But I believe that when these things happen, we are given the capacities to make them meaningful and to make them deepening. And that's our task as human beings, not just as mothers or fathers or children or brothers or sisters, but as human beings.
This is very inspiring, but the last sentence really raises an important question, and I see a divide in the responses in the interviews. So we benefit from it, we learn from it, but God didn't bring it about. Is that where you're holding?
Right. Yes, that's where I'm holding.
Where is God in the picture if he didn't bring it?
So I'm a deep believer in randomness. I believe that God creates holy randomness. Yes, holy randomness. This is my right, exactly. If I had a T-shirt, that's what I would put on it.
Holy randomness.
So I believe that God deliberately creates a world of randomness. And the reason that I believe that is only by randomness. When people say, for example, why do bad things happen to good people? Think about it if it were not that way. If only good things happen to good people. So people would be good, but the good wouldn't be for goodness' sake. It would be instrumental. Why am I being good? So the good things will happen for me, right? It's pure schar nonish. It's pure reward and punishment. I'm going to do these mitzvot. When I do these mitzvot, I won't get cancer. Since I don't want to get cancer, I will do this. But if it's random, and you know that it's random, and you do something good despite the fact that there may never be a reward, then it's real goodness. And so the only way you can create a world, I think, of genuine goodness is if you create a world of genuine randomness, which means that you could be a very righteous person and live a very difficult life. You could be a very bad person and live a very good life. But you will be, in that case, truly a righteous person and truly a bad person. If you're a bad person, you live a bad life, then you're going to change, and it won't. Anyway, so I see these things as happen. Like, I've had cancer a couple of times. People would say to me, "Why do you get cancer?" And my answer was, I don't think that God looked down and said, that Wolpe could use a little lymphoma. Would be good for him. But I think that given that it happened, how I react is and I really do believe that God can be with you as a strength in the struggle, but not that God gives you a specific test. So that's what I hold by.
Well, that's a very distinct theology. Thank you for sharing it so articulately. let's talk about another aspect of the challenges here. Deprivation, right? You lose your freedom,
Yes.
you lose your mobility, you lose your money, you lose some friends. You lose. How does one deal with loss?
I'm going to a little bit recur to the same theology, which is I wrote a book a long time ago called Making Loss Matter. So the idea was that you have to figure out what in that loss not is good for you, but what in that loss can be made good. So, for example, if you lose friends, so you reinvest doubly in the friends that you have that are still with you. If you lose your health, if you're lucky enough to regain it, you appreciate it in a new way, or you use even your ill health to help others understand what it is to have ill health. I mean, I remember I mentioned that I had cancer. I made sure to go to the synagogue and to speak when I was bald and going through chemo, because I wanted people to know that to be sick is not to be dead, and that to the extent that you can still do things, you shouldn't be terrified of the possibility of getting sick, because that's part of life too. It's not anybody's favorite part of life, but it's still part of life. And in every loss, I believe, there is, I don't even want to say a silver lining, because Abba Eban once said Jews like their clouds without silver linings. But I think that in every loss, there is something that you can find that matters or is meaningful. And if you can focus on that rather than the loss, it will help you cope with the loss that you can't change, because very often these losses are things that we can't change. And the loss of freedom, though, I just want to say, it's temporary. If you stay healthy, it's temporary, and you're doing it so that you will stay healthy. So the loss of freedom may be difficult, but the difficulties that will end are much easier than difficulties that won't end.
Okay, there is indeed consistency in your theology. So let's look at another aspect of this. This thing started in China, and it's hitting us here. And the flip side of it is that your Seder, instead of just celebrating it with whoever is right now inside your four walls, you're celebrating with the entire family using Zoom. So this whole thing is bringing out the whole question of the boundaries and interconnectivity. So interconnectivity is part of the solution to our loneliness, to our sense of solitude. But what are its deeper foundations, deeper theoretical, metaphysical foundations? And what does that require of us in terms of how we adapt our lives and live them in light of whatever realization we can come to through this corona about interconnectivity?
So it is an unsurprisingly profound question from you, because I know you think about such things, and I would start with this, if I may be allowed a slightly chauvinistic comment, that is pro-Jewish chauvinistic comment. So I've noted before that our New Year, Rosh Hashanah, is in Hebrew it's Hayom Harat Olam, the day the world was created. In Christianity, the New Year is celebrated from the birth of Jesus. In Islam, from the journey of Muhammad. The Greeks, the first Olympic Games. In other words, it was about the start of their culture. Judaism doesn't actually make the New Year about the first Jew. It's not about Abraham. It's about the creation of the world. Because our most important statement in our tradition is that every human being is created in God's image. And in that sense, it's a deeply universal tradition. And so the fact that everybody is interconnected is, first of all, a validation of our particularistic tradition that says in its opening statements that everybody is connected. Adam isn't Jewish. Noah isn't Jewish. And so I never feel that it is a threat to Jewish particularity to recognize that everybody is interconnected. In fact, I feel it's an affirmation of something we have always said to the world. That's why, I don't know if you know this, but it's a beautiful comment by Cynthia Ozick about the shofar. She says the shofar has a narrow end and a broad end. If you start off by blowing in the broad end, you get nothing. But if you start off by blowing in the narrow end, you get a sound everyone can hear. And so it's the same thing, I think, with our tradition, is that the narrow end ends up in the broad. So as somebody who I know knows a lot about other traditions, I think that you can identify with this notion. So I like the more than anything else that has ever happened in my lifetime, and maybe more than anything else that has ever happened in the history of the world, this enables people to understand the interconnectedness of all human beings.
This meaning the coronavirus.
Yes, this the coronavirus. A guy bites a bat in China, and you and I are on Zoom, and that is a direct. I mean, it's a direct effect of the first cause. So that's a remarkable thing, and in some ways, it's a terrible, but it's also a beautiful thing to think about that. And it should give us. It should be both. It should give us a deeper understanding of racism and a deeper way to overcome it. And I'll tell you what I mean. I think that part of human racism, and this insight is not original with me, but I will nonetheless repeat it as though it were. Part of the reason why there is such suspicion of other groups is evolutionary and biological. I mean, other groups have viruses and diseases, like when the Pilgrims came to the United States, that other groups, so you have this natural suspicion of others almost evolutionarily. But we're in a different age, and we can spiritually now transcend that because we understand that all human beings are interconnected, and we're all in this fight for health and disease together. And so this could be the beginning of a different level of understanding and acknowledgement by transcending that evolutionary limitation with a spiritual outreach. And we are kin to the people in Wuhan because we are facing the same thing that they had. And right now, all over the world, it's remarkable to think that people are quarantining themselves just like you are and I am. And I want to say one other thing again to bring it back to the particular. This has been the historical experience of the Jew. Because we were scattered all over the world, we always knew when we were having a Seder, when we were lighting Shabbos candles, there were people all over the world that were doing the same thing. That's why we felt a kinship to them. And now there are people all over the world that are doing the same thing, but they're doing it not as Jews, but as human beings. So there are lots of levels, and it's imbricated and overlaid. And I think very beautiful to think about the fact that we really, really are in this together. And the earth really is the same boat. And in the midrashic image, in the image of the rabbis, somebody who drills a hole and says it's only on my side of the boat, all of a sudden you discover that there are no boundaries anymore. So
I'm going to ask you a question because I know you're a vegetarian. I think you'll be receptive to it, and we're going to discover another layer in response to that. And that is that the metaphor of the boat is not a living thing. Right. And the boat is an inanimate, for all intents and purposes, is inanimate, and therefore the thrust of your presentation was all to do with humans and the interconnectivity of humans and applying the notion of the image of God. But there may be something in this coronavirus that also has to do with interconnectivity and interspecies and the whole relationship between humans and the connection to other aspects of being, and what do we learn from that? And knowing some of your sensitivity to that, how does that dimension of interconnectivity play out in this corona crisis?
So when I've been asked the question, in 100 years, what will people look back on that we're doing now that we shouldn't be doing? Just like, we look back on slavery and we can't imagine. I think that the time will come when people won't understand how people ate animals. I really do. And that's for other reasons, but part of the reason now is all these diseases, they all come from animals. I mean, even E. coli originally comes from the runoff of cows and not from plants. And the world would be a much healthier place ecologically, climate-wise, and also from disease. Nobody ever got a virus from biting into a bean. So there's, first of all, this sense that when I say we're all interconnected, you enlarged the picture very beautifully. We're all interconnected, not just as human beings, but as living creatures. And what I've discovered also is when I've made vegetarian or vegan comments on like Twitter, the anger that you get in response is astonishing, because I don't feel angry at meat eaters, but there is a very deep, you are trying to change something fundamental about my life, that you get as a blowback. And so I think this is going to be, not to compare. I am not comparing slavery and eating meat, but slavery took a civil war. Sometimes to change people's conceptions, it takes a long time and some terrible things. And if coronavirus helped change the way people think about eating animals, that would be that would be a good thing. And I hope that will happen, at least a little bit. I'm not expecting, and I'm curious whether you are. I'm not expecting a radical transformation in human consciousness from this, but a few steps forward, I think, is very possible. What do you think?
I think this is a very important issue to put on the table, the whole question of relationship to animals. Certainly the abuse, this is what we're suffering now as a consequence of, immediate consequence of abuse of the animal kingdom.
Yes.
And some kind of retaliation. Now, it could be part of larger abuses that we have towards nature, or Mother Nature, if you will. So there is, to me, personally, and I'm not really part of this interview, to me personally, I look at the various reasonings that people are giving, and very of them are very limited. Homophobics get a ride, and anti cell phone people get a ride, and people who want to encourage keeping Shabbos get a ride. But to me, the most coherent explanation has to do with interspecies relations and a global natural retaliation. And I can't imagine that something so major would happen without leaving its after effects.
Right. I think you're very persuasive. I think you're right. It will leave after effects. I don't know how many after effects, but there is this feeling about it. And the abuse, when you say abuse, I just want to make clear to people, if you explore how cows are factory farmed or chickens are factory farmed, inevitably I discover that when people really look at it, you only have two choices, which is you either look away or you stop eating them.
Yeah.
Because the collective amount of pain that we inflict on living sentient creatures is stunning and overwhelming. So yes, I think that abuse is certainly not too strong a word.
So let's draw that into the final conclusion, which is the day after. And we've just spoken about possible changes in consciousness. I think personally, if you ask me my opinion, I think it has to do with how long this is going to go. If the longer it goes, the deeper the changes. And my hunch is it's not going to be all that quick, because if there is intentionality, and here I differ from you, I suspect there is intent. See, this is the question we spoke about. Okay, God didn't bring it about. And what's the difference theologically between saying God didn't bring about, but nature is reacting? It's really ultimately not that far theologically. So if there is, shall we say, a karmic response, an action-reaction, which is permitted or controlled by the laws of God rather than by the will of God, but the will of God will manifest in laws of God, God ends up being in the picture. You can't really push him out too much.
No, I don't want to push God out of the picture. I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with God set the world up in certain ways so that things that we do have reactions. That I'm much more comfortable with than the idea that God said, they're doing this, so I'm gonna jump in and do that. That, so yes,
you're,
that I do.
You're a karma kind of guy rather than a reward and punishment.
Well, yes and no, because the thing is that I don't believe that karma is automatic or inevitable, in the sense that I believe in individual lives. There are people who lead bad lives who do well, people who lead good lives who do badly. So I don't want to make karma too automatic. What I would say is that my conception of God has gotten more mystical and abstract over time. And so I believe deeply in God, a creator, and God as a something. I don't know, there is no good English word, a being, a force, or whatever you want to call it, that with whom I can enter into relationship and according to whom I can live my life in a certain way. And I see Judaism, and this may offend some of your listeners, but I've started the sentence, so now I have to finish it. I see Judaism as the language that we speak to God. That is what Judaism is to me. It's a language of action and of words, of ritual and so on, of ethics. That's part of our dialogue. I see Judaism as our means of having a dialogue with God, as there are other religions that have other means of having dialogue with God. Now, that leaves aside, of course, the question of intellectual assertions, whether things are true or not true. But nonetheless, I see traditions as symbol systems and languages that we speak to God, and God responds to us in a certain way. But I don't believe in an automatic karmic thing. I believe that God does set the universe up in certain ways, that some things will have reactions, but there's a lot.
I think maybe part of the issue is that the notion of karmic that you're rejecting may not be as nuanced as the notion of karma that people who grew up in that culture apply, or how they live it. In other words,
well, you would know well. So right. I once had an argument with Sadhguru that went on quite some time. We had a public dialogue about this, about whether karma was correct or not, and his essential argument was what you were saying, which is that my notion of
you mean
karma,
from Tamil Nadu, from
exactly.
Coimbatore.
Yes.
Yeah.
And his argument was exactly what you're saying, which is that my karma is much too automatic and much too unnuanced to be legitimate.
As someone who spends a lot of time with Hindus, it seems to me that his perspective is more representative. In other words, karma is not as mechanical as you propose. But closing the parentheses of this little theological conversation here, the bottom line is that really the sense of a cosmic, natural reaction of violation of the laws of God does provide a framework that you can relate to, which then invites us to reflect on how our world will be different.
Yes. Well, nicely done. You brought us back to the ikar, to the essence of it. And I would say that our world will be different. First of all, there has clearly got to be a shift of consciousness in how interconnected we are. I mean, people who were very nationalistic and thought my country is essentially all that exists, which is much easier to do in America, for example, than in Israel. Because what people who never lived in America don't realize is I can explain the mentality of America most easily by saying 4 words: Canada, Mexico, ocean, ocean, right? We have basically, and the oceans remarkably have never attacked us, not the Pacific, not the Atlantic. And when you realize how self-contained America truly is, it's not surprising that it thinks of itself as self-contained. That's not possible anymore. You can't do it. And so I think I don't know how that will ripple through the consciousness of the world, but if it's rippling through the consciousness of America, then it will. Because by blessings of geography, we are so self-contained that the realization that we're not at all self-contained is, I think, a salutary, overdue, and could have very good consequences.
So listen, David, what I hear is like this. You basically are holding a theology that, after putting aside some childish notions like God punishing or karma being limited, is actually much more nuanced. You're able to look at the whole thing, despite the hardships, as something good. You have a certain vision that, in theory, you can take to the world, including attitude to animals and vegetarianism. So with all this, are you able to get in front of your congregants and speak like this? Because you started out as a psychologist, and you're finishing this interview as a psychologist, and you're finishing as a metaphysician. So are you able to deliver this message to your population, or is it only me who brings it out in you?
No, I really do. I really do. It's in my books, it's in my columns, it's in my sermons. I really do say that to people. And it's in the dialogues that I do. And I think a lot of people are receptive to it. I'll tell you that here's what I have found. Those people that want the rabbi to tell them exactly what to do and exactly how to feel and exactly what's right and wrong are uncomfortable with me. Those people that want the rabbi to open up possibilities and to ask questions and to explore things as opposed to give dictates are much more comfortable. And so when I raise these issues, and I'm willing to listen, when someone disagrees with me, I don't say, you're wrong. I'm willing to listen and engage in the dialogue. So I find that most people are receptive to that. It is the attitude of undogmatism coupled with real belief that I think allows you to say things. If you really believe things, but you are willing to hear the opposite side, because and the other way this is illustrated is I have a congregation that is politically very divided, very divided. I have half right wing, half left wing politically, and I listen to both of them, and that's what allows them, I think, to still stay as part of the same community because they feel heard.
You listen, but you take no side.
Well, it depends what it is. Sometimes privately, I will take a side more than publicly. Publicly, only when I feel it's absolutely necessary. Privately, anybody who asks me, I'm happy to say what I think.
Let me add one point. Even though I think we've said the most important things, I want to add something just by way of the personal dialogue between us. You'd said earlier that some people who watch this might be offended by your notion of religion as a language.
Yes.
So one of the things that happened during this Corona time is that a book of mine came out titled Religious Truth. It's a book that came out I just got a notification of it 2-3 days ago in the Littman Library, which is a very important place of Jewish ideas. And it's a series of it's a project that I did. So it's an edited volume of multiple voices, but as the editor, I have quite a voice there. And I look at the whole question of how do we deal with the question of religious truth as part of interreligious relations in our view of other religions, and what kind of a simplistic or more sophisticated notion do we have? And one of the notions that I actually put forth there in my own thinking is this notion of religions as languages and the appeal to the linguistic metaphor as a basis for understanding the simultaneous need and existence and legitimacy of different religions. I personally do not find the notion of the linguistic analogy offensive, and I think that there are actually many precedents for it. And again, if there's one thing I can leave you with is an invitation to explore more deeply the thought of Rav Kook, because I believe that I've actually found this notion in his own thinking. Because when you start to think of people and languages, then people and languages actually open up to different spiritual approaches towards the divine through the linguistic metaphor. So I actually think that is something that is not only to me and hopefully to others not offensive, but I actually think a very helpful tool.
And it is certainly, I'm sure, one of the reasons why Rav Kook was able to do what you're able to do, which is open himself to the East, which is a rare thing in Jewish teachings. That is his exchange of letters with people in Japan and others. That's very rare, obviously, in the Jewish tradition. We tend to be Western European.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Oh, yeah. He has a dialogue with a couple of people in Japan. I think it's in Mirsky's book, if I'm not mistaken, but it might not be. I'll find it and send it to you. But this idea, and also in his poetry, Rechavim, about expanses, and the idea that he's an enlarging figure, as you point out, as you are. I don't know of another Jewish scholar who's, at least in my ambit, that has seriously explored Hinduism. So that is a way that it shows that we can speak to other traditions out of our own tradition, which I think is beautiful and wonderful.
So may this coronavirus open up new possibilities, and I hope the project that you've just contributed to will create new opportunities for making connections, interconnections between people and ideas and thoughts, and show the power of religions coming together to deliver a message in their particularity, but also in their commonality, to help guide the world at a time when it really needs guidance. Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.